The Panama Canal, one of the most monumental engineering projects in world history, stands as a symbol of human ingenuity, perseverance, and geopolitical ambition. Stretching across the narrow isthmus of Panama, it connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, dramatically reducing the travel distance for maritime shipping. This artificial waterway, often regarded as a marvel of engineering, took more than 3 decades to complete and left a lasting legacy on global trade, economics, and geopolitics. Its construction was not only a technological feat, but also an exercise in international diplomacy and power dynamics. The Panama Canal's completion in 1914 was the culmination of both French and American efforts, involving immense challenges, political maneuvering, and a massive workforce. At its heart, however, was the leadership of the United States, especially President Theodore Roosevelt, whose bold actions helped make the project a reality. This essay explores the reasons for building the Panama Canal, the technical challenges of its construction, the pivotal role of Theodore Roosevelt, and the long-lasting economic and geopolitical impacts of its creation. The idea of constructing a canal across the Isthmus of Panama dates back to the 16th century, with early explorers like Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who first crossed the isthmus and realized the potential for a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. However, it wasn't until the 19th century that the feasibility of such a canal began to be seriously considered. The primary motivation for building the Panama Canal was economic and strategic. In the mid-1800s, global trade was expanding, and maritime shipping between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans was an expensive, time-consuming, and often dangerous endeavor. Before the canal, ships had to travel around the southern tip of South America, either through the Strait of Magellan or around Cape Horn, which added thousands of miles to the journey. For the United States, the need for a canal became increasingly urgent during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As American influence expanded in the Pacific following the Spanish-American War, 1898, and the acquisition of territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, the United States needed a faster and more efficient way to move naval ships and commercial vessels between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The canal would significantly reduce the travel distance between the eastern and western coasts of the Americas, cutting the journey time from 6,000 miles to just 50 miles. This reduction in distance would be a boon for global trade, making shipping goods more efficient and less costly. In addition to economic considerations, there were also geopolitical motivations behind the push for the canal. The United States, as a rising power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sought to project its influence globally. The canal would not only facilitate military mobility, allowing U.S. naval ships to quickly move between the two oceans, but it would also serve as a symbol of American technological prowess and international power. By controlling a vital global trade route, the U.S. would enhance its strategic position in the Western Hemisphere and ensure its dominance in both the Atlantic and Pacific regions. The canal was seen as essential for maintaining and expanding American military and economic influence on the world stage. The concept of building a canal through Central America was not new when the United States took up the challenge. In fact, the French made the first serious attempt to construct the Panama Canal in the late 19th century. The French effort to build a canal in Panama began in 1881 under the leadership of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the engineer who had overseen the construction of the Suez Canal in Egypt. De Lesseps was initially confident that a similar canal could be built in Panama, and the French began the project with great enthusiasm. However, the challenges faced by the French were immense. The geography of the Panama Isthmus was far more difficult than the flat terrain of Egypt. The region was plagued by tropical diseases, particularly malaria and yellow fever, which devastated the French workforce. The project was also fraught with technical and financial difficulties, and the lack of adequate drainage and sanitation efforts contributed to a high mortality rate among workers. By 1889, after spending millions of francs and losing thousands of workers to disease and accidents, the French project was abandoned, and the canal effort was deemed a failure. After the collapse of the French effort, the idea of building a canal through Panama was taken up by the United States, which had strategic and commercial interests in the region. Following the failure of the French project, Many in the US believed that completing the canal would be a tremendous asset to American trade and military power. There were several routes under consideration, including one through Nicaragua, but Panama was ultimately chosen due to its more favorable geography. Theodore Roosevelt, who became President of the United States in 1901, played a crucial role in the completion of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt was a dynamic, expansionist leader who believed that the United States should exert greater influence in the Western Hemisphere and on the world stage. His vision for the canal was driven by both strategic considerations and his belief in American exceptionalism. Roosevelt's foreign policy, often referred to as big stick diplomacy, was characterized by a willingness to use military force to achieve US objectives, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. Roosevelt's famous saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," embodied his approach to international relations. The construction of the Panama Canal was a key element of this policy. Roosevelt saw the canal as essential for maintaining American power and influence in the Western Hemisphere and globally. His administration sought to ensure that the US had the ability to control the canal and secure its strategic interests in the region. The construction of the canal required the cooperation of Panama, which was at the time a province of Colombia. The Colombian government, however, was reluctant to grant the US the necessary concessions to build the canal. Roosevelt's administration decided to support a separatist movement in Panama, which was seeking independence from Colombia. In 1903, with the backing of US warships stationed off the coast, Panama declared its independence from Colombia. This intervention was controversial, both within the United States and internationally, with critics accusing Roosevelt of using imperialist tactics. However, Roosevelt argued that the United States had an obligation to secure the canal for the greater good of global commerce and security. Once Panama became an independent nation, the newly formed government quickly signed the Haibunau-Varilla Treaty with the United States, granting the U.S. control over a 10-mile wide strip of land across the isthmus, known as the Panama Canal Zone. The U.S. would maintain control over the canal zone, and the U.S. Navy would have the right to intervene militarily if necessary to protect U.S. interests. With control over the canal zone secured, the U.S. began the monumental task of building the Panama Canal. The construction was an engineering challenge on a scale previously unseen, and it involved vast resources and a diverse workforce. The terrain of the Isthmus of Panama presented numerous difficulties. The canal had to cut through steep mountain ranges, dense tropical rainforests, and swampy lowlands. The most challenging section of the canal was the Culebra Cut, where engineers had to dig through the Continental Divide, removing millions of tons of rock and earth. The canal required the construction of several locks to lift and lower ships across varying elevations. The largest of these locks were the Gatun locks, located at the northern end of the canal. The creation of Lake Gatun, an artificial lake created by the Gatun Dam, was crucial for providing the water needed for the locks to function. One of the biggest challenges, however, was controlling the spread of disease. The region's tropical climate made it a breeding ground for mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. The Yellow Fever Commission, led by Dr. William Gorgas, successfully implemented mosquito control measures, including draining swamps and fumigating buildings. Gorgas's efforts were critical in reducing the incidence of these diseases, which had been a major cause of the high mortality rate among workers during the French effort. The construction of the canal took a little more than 10 years, from 1904 to 1914, and required the labor of thousands of workers, many of whom were brought in from the Caribbean. The final cost of the canal was approximately $375 million, a staggering sum at the time. The economic impact of the Panama Canal was immediate and profound. Before the canal, ships traveling between the east and west coasts of the United States had to navigate around the southern tip of South America, a journey that could take weeks and cost a great deal in terms of time and fuel. The canal drastically reduced the travel distance and time for ships, cutting the journey from the U.S. East Coast to the West Coast by over 8,000 miles. For global commerce, the canal opened up new trade routes, facilitating the movement of goods between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This was particularly important for the shipping of bulk goods such as oil, grain, and coal. Additionally, the canal made it more efficient for U.S. merchants and naval vessels to access both European and Asian markets. For Panama, the canal was both a boon and a burden. On the one hand, the construction of the canal brought jobs, infrastructure improvements, and international attention to the country. The canal's operation also provided Panama with a steady source of revenue, as the United States paid the country for the use of the canal zone. On the other hand, Panama's sovereignty was limited for much of the 20th century, as the United States controlled the canal zone. In 1977, the Panama Canal Treaty was signed, establishing a timetable for the gradual transfer of control back to Panama. In 1999, Panama regained full control of the canal, and it became a key asset in the country's economy. For the United States, the canal was a strategic economic asset. It facilitated faster naval mobility, especially during World War I and World War II, and allowed U.S. merchant ships to access new markets more easily. The canal also generated revenue through tolls, contributing to the U.S. economy. The construction of the Panama Canal was a monumental achievement that had lasting effects on global trade, U.S. foreign policy, and the economic development of Panama. Spearheaded by President Theodore Roosevelt, the canal project demonstrated both the technological capabilities of the time and the geopolitical ambitions of the United States. Despite the controversies surrounding the methods used to secure control over Panama, the canal ultimately became a vital link between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, revolutionizing global commerce and enhancing the strategic position of the United States. The Panama Canal's legacy continues today, with the waterway still playing a crucial role in global trade. Its construction, however, was not just about the building of a canal, but the reshaping of global power structures, the flow of international commerce, and the projection of American influence in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. Alright, that's all for today's video. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel grow.